And now, without further ado, Rabbi Yochanan Posner from Chabad of Skokie. Thank you, Rabbi Posner.
Thank you, Rabbi Masavsky. What can I say? I'm really, really happy to be here. I'm happy for my affiliation with the Chicago Rabbinical Council. Chicago is blessed that we have such a fine rabbinical organization, and I'm happy to be among such wonderful rabbis in this organization. And as I was thinking about what I would say today, it occurred to me that I was planning on quoting one thought from Rabbi Schwartz and one from Rabbi Rees. So I see how being part of the CRC has affected the way I think about Torah and Yiddishkeit, and I'm just very happy for that. Also, I'm looking at the people who are here on the Zoom chat, and here I see some of my JLI students and some of my C-teeners and some of my friends and people who I don't know are there as well. And so many nice people here together. It's really wonderful to be here. So the topic that I gave myself for tonight is why the disproportion? It's a question which anybody who studies Torah, if you read just the Parsha, you'll have this question. There are some mitzvahs in the Torah that are explained at length, entire Parshas going on and on about one general topic. Then you have some mitzvahs which get only a few words or maybe only a phrase in a pasuk, in a Torah sentence. So, for example, everybody knows that we don't mix milk and meat, but we get it from one phrase: "Don't cook the kid in his mother's milk." That's all we get for this whole big mitzvah. The mitzvah of tefillin, it's in the Shema. We say it every day, but all it says is tie it to your arms and put it on your head. It doesn't say what, doesn't say how. So some mitzvahs get so little detail in the written Torah, and others get so much detail. So think about mitzvahs like davening. It's barely alluded to in the Torah. Torah says a few words that hint at it, but that's it. Then you think about the parshas we read in the last couple of weeks. So if you scroll in your mental Torah through your brain, and you cut past the narrative in the Chumash of Bereshis and get to the mitzvahs in the Chumash of Shemais, so you have whole parshas, Truma, Titzaveh, V'yakel Pikudei, a chunk of Kisisa. It's talking entirely about building the Mishkan, building a sanctuary for Hashem in the desert, but it isn't anything that we do, and it's got so much detail. Or think about Chumash Bamidbar. So last week's parsha they read recently, it talks about counting all the numbers of all the people, a lot of detail. Mitzvahs like Shemitah and Meiser and Truma, a lot of detail. The whole Chumash Vayikra is basically about karbanos, about offerings that were brought in the temple in the Beis HaMikdash, and also a ton of detail. So why are some mitzvahs explained in the Torah at length, and some hardly a few words? It's all they get. And this question, it's a very important question, not only because it's a curiosity, but also because if we understand the issues that are in the question, then we gain a much deeper understanding of how the Torah works and how the Torah is structured. So we know that there's the written Torah, the Torah Shebeksav, and there's the oral Torah, the Torah Shebal Peh. Some people are under the mistaken impression that the oral Torah is a collection of sayings by our rabbis over the generations, and therefore it isn't part of the Torah itself. It's just something that the rabbis kind of developed and extrapolated and interpreted as time goes on. Now, there are some things in the oral Torah that indeed are in that category, but that isn't the bulk of what the oral Torah actually is. What the oral Torah, or Torah Shebal Peh actually is, it's the meaning of the written Torah. And it's impossible for either Torah to exist without the other one. If we wouldn't have the oral Torah, there wouldn't be the written Torah. If there wouldn't be the written Torah, there wouldn't be the oral Torah. And just to illustrate this, I'm going to test out my abilities to use technology in front of all you people. And, well, I'm going to try to screen share and show you some interesting things. So, pardon me for a moment while I set that up. Here we go. Okay. Okay, so do you guys, are you seeing my, you're not seeing my screen. Okay, once.
Press share.
One second. Okay, I figured out what I need to do. Sorry about that delay. Okay, here we are. Okay, so what do you see on the screen? You see 3 letters, BRD, right? There's no vowels, only consonants. Now, how many words can you write using these 3 consonants? If you want to share it in the chat. I can think of a lot of words. Beard, board, broad, and many, many more, right? And so all we have in the Torah, if you think about it, is consonants, because there are no vowels in the Torah. And so if not for the oral Torah, we would have no idea how to even read the written Torah. And so, for example, the famous pasuk, it says, Lo yisavashel gdi b'chalei v'imoi, which means don't cook a kid in its mother's what? Well, the word there, is it chalav or is it chalev? There's no way of knowing from the context whether it says don't cook the kid in the mother's milk or in the mother's fat. So I remember being a student in Cheder Lubavitch, right here in the Chicago area, and we learned in 2nd and 3rd grade about context clues. If you aren't sure what a word means, look at the context and you can figure it out. But the context won't tell you what this pasuk means. The only way that we know it means milk and it doesn't mean fat is because that is the tradition given down to us in the oral Torah, which teaches us how to read the written Torah. At the same token, the written Torah has no punctuation. So, for example, what do we have here? And if you're a married man, don't try this at home. Well, it depends where you put the punctuation. Woman, without her, man is nothing. So that upholds a woman. Or woman without her man, she's nothing. Like, she actually has no first name. She's just, I don't know, she's just Mrs. Yochanan Posner, like those old-fashioned people used to do. This is my favorite. Punctuation saves lives. Let's eat grandma, or let's eat grandma. And so without the oral Torah, we would have no idea what the written Torah is talking about. And the question is, well, why didn't Moshe write more stuff down? Why didn't Moshe record every single thing we have to know? So that way we shouldn't have to rely on a tradition that's passed down by heart from person to person. Let it all be in a book, and we'll all know what the Torah means, not relying on the frail transmission of information through an oral tradition. And there are several reasons for this. One reason is because no matter how well you transcribe it, if it's written, there's always going to be things that are not clear. And our country, United States of America, has a wonderful constitution which illustrates that for us beautifully. Because, one second. Because nobody knows what the Second Amendment means. People do know, but the difference is opinion, right? Is the right to bear arms limited to a militia, or do all the people of the state have the right to bear arms? And for this, we need the Supreme Court to spend lots of time figuring these things out. And so it's impossible to clarify everything in writing. But that isn't the only reason that isn't the only reason that we have to have a written Torah as well as an oral Torah. I forgot how to stop sharing. Here, stop sharing. Okay, there we go. And I noticed that when I teach classes, and some people just listen, and some people listen and write notes. And if you're a new teacher, you might think that only the people who are writing notes are actually absorbing the information. But I found often it isn't the case. Sometimes they're so busy writing notes, they aren't even listening to what I'm saying. And they've written down everything I said, but they don't understand the word that I said. And sometimes the note writing is a distraction from absorbing the information. By the same token, the more we have the ability to record information, the less better we listen. So it used to be that we all knew all the phone numbers by heart. But ever since we got smartphones, I don't know my own phone number. I don't know my wife's phone number. I don't know anybody's phone number because I have a smartphone. So my brain conveniently erased everything. So if Hashem would record everything in writing for us in the entire Torah, what would happen is we would know nothing. And I think another very important point is, I remember back in my wild younger years, I spent some time backpacking in Europe, and I spent about a week in Spain. And I just wandered around and did whatever young people do in that situation. And I met a woman in Spain who told me that she comes from a Jewish descent. She believes her family are conversos. And we began talking. I thought it was really interesting, and I wanted to talk to her and encourage her in her Yiddishkeit. But I realized that talking to her, well, it kind of made me uncomfortable. And the reason is because even though she was studying Judaism from books, and she actually seemed to have been reading the Shulchan Aruch, but she did not know so many things that we take for granted. Some of them weren't such a big deal. For example, she kept telling me about how she was reading the book by Rabbi Joseph. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Oh, you mean the Mechaber. Oh, you mean the Beis Yosef. Like, we don't call him Rabbi Joseph. It's not his name, right? And then she began pronouncing Hashem's name, Yud Kei Vav Kei, which we would never do. Even though she's read many books of Torah and she read the Chumash, but she didn't know basics that every child who grows up in a Jewish home knows, because you can't get it all from a book. So the ideal way to transmit the Torah for generations is that it's a mix of oral and a mix of written. And the great example of this is from our very own Rabbi Gedalia Dov Schwartz, because I remember him saying in his classes, and recently I had a chance to reread his book, which if you haven't read it yet, Shari Gedula, you should buy it and read it now. I'm sure he's happy to sell it to you. So in his book, he recounts his memories of his childhood and of the very interesting Jewish American history which he knows. And what I found interesting about Rabbi Schwartz is there are some halachic questions which he decided, which to my knowledge have become CRC policy, and so all of us are relying on some level on those decisions, and he learned those halachas not from a book, but from watching his mother cook in her kitchen, and watching his mother, how she koshered chickens and salted them and removed the blood to make them kosher. Because that's something you can't learn from a book. You only can learn that from actual exposure to it and through experiences. Now, what I'm going to show you on the screen next, well, it might look like gibberish, but if you had a certain experience that I think some of you in this meeting had, then you'll know what it is. One moment. Okay, what does that say? Now, some people who are like, Posner, you're crazy. What are you showing us gibberish for? But there are probably some people who know what that stands for. I know that if I pull this out at home and my daughter sees it, she'll know what it is immediately. And let me tell you what this is. To illustrate this point, to illustrate the point that the Torah is transmitted best through a combination of the written Torah and the oral Torah, we played a game in our classes as part of the Jewish Learning Institute. And we played the game called Broken Telephone. I whispered something to the first person in the room, and it was passed by whisper, person to person, and after it had gone through 30, 40, or 50 people, so it was completely different. But then I added just this. We added a clue. And I whispered to the first person, and I pointed at these letters. The shy green lion has too much to drink and fell out the window. And then I gave that first person that piece of paper and said, pass the secret on. And amazingly, 50 people passed that on, and it came out 100% accurately. It's gibberish, it's meaningless, it's pointless. The too much to drink and out the window, what does it even mean? And now and then I meet people who are in the room and I ask them, what did the shy green lion do? And they all remember. He had too much to drink and he fell out the window. Why is that? Because there's a mixture of written and oral. The experience, the way it was taught to you, that is retained in your memory. But in case it gets a little shaky and you begin forgetting it, you have those written clues that remind you it was a shy green lion. It was not a loud, rambunctious rhinoceros. And that's how you remember it. And so the oral Torah is intrinsic to the written Torah, and the written Torah is intrinsic to the oral Torah. Neither one can really fully be observed without the other. And that's why the Gemara in Eruvin says that when each time Hashem gave Moshe a new parsha, Hashem revealed to Moshe Rabbeinu a new section of the written Torah, he immediately called together Aaron and his sons and the Zekanim, and immediately he began teaching it, because every bit of Torah text was delivered with Torah teaching that was explained immediately to the Jewish people. So now that we know all that, now that we understand the interplay between the written Torah and the oral Torah, and we understand how the Torah was given and how the Torah is meant to be preserved, and we understand what we're doing when we study Torah. When we study Gemara and Mishnayos and Halacha, what we're really doing is we're reviewing the original meaning of the written Torah itself. Now that we know all that, now we can understand why there's a disproportion in how much attention the written Torah gives to the various mitzvahs. Because think about it. Think about it. Remember, I gave examples in the beginning of some mitzvahs that are written very short and some that are written more at length. Think about what those mitzvahs have in common. Mitzvahs that are short include things like tefillin, mezuzah, kosher, eating matzah on Pesach, blowing shofar. Those are all mitzvahs that are written, short in the Torah. Then think about mitzvahs that are long in the Torah. So it's Shemitah and Mitzorah and building a Mishkan and counting the Jewish people in the desert. And what do all those mitzvahs have in common? Well, the ones that are short, what they have in common with each other is they're all mitzvahs that we observe today on a regular basis. And the ones that are longer, what do they have in common? They're mitzvahs that are not observed today for many of us, maybe for some of us who live in Israel and Eretz Yisrael. But they definitely were not observed by many Jews in many times. So building a Mishkan, it was a one-time thing. If it's not going to be, it's a one-time thing. Keeping all those laws all those mitzvahs that depend on the Jewish people living in Israel, well, conditions change. Not all of us live in Israel. Think about all the attention devoted to korbanos, to animal offerings. The whole Chumash Vayikra is devoted to that. It's all stuff that we don't do today in Skokie. And if you would, you'd probably be arrested. And so, you see, the ones that are short are the ones that we still do, and the ones that are long are the ones that we aren't doing here and weren't done by many Jews throughout Jewish history. So, I'm not sure if this idea is written in Sfarim or this just fell into my head somehow, but I hope it's true. I think that Hashem deliberately devoted more space in the written Torah to mitzvahs that he knew in advance wouldn't be observed by everyone for all the generations. And the mitzvahs which got less space in the written Torah are the ones that were observed every single day or every single week or every single year from the moment they were given up until today. So think about it. The Mitzvah of Shabbos. Shabbos is a really complicated area in halacha. It's a huge Masechta in Gemara and in Mishnayos. It's a lot of Shulchan Aruch, a lot of complicated halachas involved in keeping Shabbos. Right? We know Shabbos has 39 types of prohibited work, and each has many subcategories. But what does the Torah say in the written Torah? It just says, don't make a fire, don't work, remember it, sanctify it, and don't go out of your space. Doesn't say anything else in the written Torah other than that, right? So we know that the types of work that were used to build the Mishkan, to build the sanctuary in the desert, are the same kinds of work that are prohibited on Shabbos. Okay, great. So why are these 39 types of work communicated in the Mishkan building context and not in the Shabbos observing context? It's in the Torah on some level, in the written Torah, so why is it like here and not there? Think about it. Shabbos was observed every single week from the time that, either from when it was given by Matan Torah or from after Yom Kippur, Parshas Ki Sisa. But from that point on, definitely, it was observed every single week. And Moshe told the Jewish people what types of work they aren't allowed to do. There's 39 types of them, and they have subcategories, and therefore, you can't do this, 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 and this. And it wasn't forgotten. You know why it wasn't forgotten? Because they did it every week. And in case they got a little hazy and they needed a clue, like the shy green lion, well, it's right there in the written Torah. Just read the story of the construction of the Mishkan, and it'll remind you what those 39 types of prohibited work are. And the more I look at the mitzvahs, the more I see this pattern. Why is there so much detail in Chumash Vayikra for korbanos? Well, maybe it's because Hashem knew when he gave the Torah that although it would be easy to remember all that when they had a Mishkan and Beis HaMikdash, but what's going to happen when the exile starts, when the Gala starts, and we're no longer able to bring korbanos in the Beis HaMikdash? If it wouldn't be recorded in the written Torah and it would just be up to us to remember it, we'd have some hazy memory, but we wouldn't know what they all are. It's known that the Chafetz Chaim made sure all the Kohanim in his town, in Radin, all knew all the halachas involved in operating the Beis HaMikdash. That when Mashiach comes, they'll be ready right away to go do the avodah in the Beis HaMikdash. If we didn't have all those parshas, would we remember it all properly? And so I think it's a really important thing. And it's even deeper than that. You look at some mitzvahs that were given in the desert, given by Har Sinai, which only would become relevant 40 years later when the Jewish people enter Eretz Yisrael. Those too often are given in great detail, like the laws of Shemitah and Yovel, for example. Doesn't happen right away, only happens when they enter the lands. Actually more, it's 40 years plus 14 years until they begin keeping those mitzvahs. there in detail, because if they'll only be given the way Hashem tells us to put on tefillin, just tie them to your arms. That's it. Just keep the sabbatical years. That's all it would say. It could be forgotten. And so what we see here is that although the Torah was given thousands of years ago, Hashem gave the Torah for us to have forever. It's written in such a way that only makes sense if the intention of it is for it to last forever. My grandfather was once called to explain to a group of donors why the school he ran, the yeshiva he ran, spent so much time on Judaic studies and not that much time on secular studies. So he said, look, he held up a chumash. He said, it's this book, we like the author. And of course they laughed, and they gave the grant that was being sought. And so the author of the Torah, Hashem wrote the Torah in a manner that it was clearly intended for it to be relevant and used all times, forever, even now, even in modern times. And I think I'll make 1 point or 2 points in the 5 minutes left to this class. We know that toward the end of the Second Temple era, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi began to write down the oral Torah, which had never been written down before and was prohibited to be written down. He wrote it down in the form of the Mishnah. And the Mishnah is an organized, systemized code of all the laws, all the halachas in the oral Torah. But many people ask the question, why is it that some mitzvahs seem to be entirely left out of the Mishnah? For example, where's the Masechta on Mezuzah? And where's the Masechta on Tzitzis? And on Tefillin? And on Chanukah? It's not there. We have a Masechta about Purim called Megillah, so why isn't there a Masechta about Chanukah? And the Rambam in Pirsha Mishnayos answers this question. And he says that Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi only wrote down the parts of the oral Torah that were in danger of being forgotten because of the persecution that the Jews were about to face with the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. So, but mitzvahs that were observed by everybody, that was common, that everyone knew about, like tefillin. There's a pair of tefillin in every home. There's a mezuzah on every door. There was no reason to record those things because they would never be forgotten, because the people had the actual stuff to look at. They look at the tefillin, and they knew how to make tefillin. But the question still remains, and there are many mefarshim that try to deal with this question. And the question is, why didn't the Mishnah say anything about Chanukah? And the Lubavitcher Rebbe answers this question. The Rebbe explains that there weren't artifacts for Chanukah, like still in mezuzahs and tzitzis, but Chanukah was relatively recent history. And therefore, that information was so commonly known. And there were books that were available then, which recorded the Chanukah story, so there was no danger of it being forgotten. So think about this. Let's compare the written Torah and the Mishnah. Hashem writes the written Torah with foreknowledge and foresight of the future, and takes into account all the changes and conditions that will happen in the future, and writes it in a way that will remember the entire thing forever. Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi records the Mishnah in such a way that deals with the issues of his time, things that may be forgotten or things that won't be forgotten in his generation. But do we still have those books today commonly available about Chanukah? We don't. And so it's important for us to understand this, and so the Torah is relevant forever. And now we're in a situation that certain parts of the Torah aren't being observed by us in the last few months, because we're in a time that we can't daven with a minyan. And the same way that for all these years we observed the mitzvah of korbanos and so on, by studying those sections in the Torah, today we observe the mitzvah of davening with a minyan by talking about davening with a minyan and studying those halachas. And I want to quote Rabbi Rees, who pointed out that in Shulchan Aruch it says, "Lo olam yishtadol adam." A person should always try to daven with a minyan. And as long as we're trying and we're active and we're thinking of opening up the shul and reading letters about it and we're active in the topic, that also is a form of observance of davening in a minyan and davening in shul. And by us being active in all these things, in davening properly at home or at shul, learning Torah, all parts of Torah, the written Torah and the oral Torah. By doing this, we will bring Mashiach speedily in our days and be able to have all the questions answered and observe all the mitzvahs in Torah with goodness and with a glad heart. Amen. L'chaim.
Amen.
Thank you.
Rabbi Posner.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Posner. Really appreciate the share.